Hello, welcome. It's working. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you all here this evening. I'm Sherry Jones, the director here at the Coastal Georgia Historical Society. Tonight's lecture, celebrating 100 years of connection, is presented in partnership with the Torras Foundation. We're looking forward to the Causeway celebration as well on Saturday, July 13th, and are really excited to be involved in a community-wide effort highlighting a structure that is so central to Glynn County. After the lecture, Darren Peach, who is the president of Torras Properties, will tell us a little bit more about the upcoming celebration. The F.J. Torras Causeway occupied a unique place in our community, even before its construction. For years, residents here and visitors who passed through our area dreamed of easier access to St. Simon's. Some thought that the project was impossible. Through the ingenuity of individuals like Brunswick Mayor Malcolm McKinnon, Glynn County Chairman E.L. Stevens, and engineer F.J. Torras, our coastal Georgia area would prove that it was possible indeed. The Causeway officially opened on June 26, 1924, exactly a century ago today. Pretty special. The opening day was followed by an official celebration in mid-July that included a parade and a pageant and dignitaries from all over the state. Our presenter this evening, Allison Dupuis, is the Director of Public Programming here at the Historical Society. She's enjoyed researching and developing this special lecture on the history and construction of the Causeway. Tonight, we are proud to celebrate the achievements of individuals like F.J. Torras, who contributed to the dynamic evolution of coastal Georgia. Allison?
Thank you, Sherry, and thank all of you for coming out tonight, especially with that weather that I can see out the windows right now, because that looks really fun to drive through, especially if you had to drive over here. I also wanted to tell you guys, just because I thought it was funny, that someone asked me earlier if the other two people speaking with me today were around the same height as me. So I told him I would probably have to adjust the microphone down just a little bit. But can everyone hear me well? Okay, perfect. So today, 100 years after its construction, and exactly 100 years after its opening to car traffic, the F.J. Torras Causeway, connecting Brunswick and St. Simon's, is such an essential part of our daily lives that we tend to take its presence as a given. It's hard to imagine living in a Glynn County in which the Causeway does not exist, whether we join traffic across it every day to go to work, or count the minutes and miles across it as we arrive for a much-anticipated yearly vacation. The marsh-spanning road didn't appear out of thin air, though. Instead, the Causeway and its instrumentality to us today is the result of decades of dedicated work by individuals and groups to build good roads, to promote the Golden Isles as a community and as a destination, and to maintain this vital link between Brunswick and St. Simon's. We, as one community, have imagined, built, and kept the Causeway over more than a century. Thanks to visionaries like F.J. Torras, Malcolm McKinnon, and others who saw the value the project would bring to the Golden Isles, the Brunswick-St. Simon's Highway, as it was called around the time when this postcard was made, is absolutely crucial to modern-day Glynn County and to our own understanding of our history. To fully explore this history, though, we have to start before the Causeway, and in fact, before any highways at all. Shortly before the turn of the 20th century, change was on the horizon for Glynn County. In the wake of the Civil War, our area had begun to explore new industries, but by 1888, the county was starting to recognize a new potential in tourism. The Jekyll Island Club had its opening season that year, but it wasn't just the rich and famous who wanted to visit the Golden Isles. All kinds of tourists found value here, and that demand, combined with a local ingenuity and a drive for progress, would change what transportation looked like here, eventually leading us to the construction and use of the F.J. Torras Causeway. In those very first months of 1888, though, our area was changing, and both residents and passersby knew it. An editor for the Brunswick Weekly Advertiser Appeal carefully noted the comments of railroad passengers as they traveled into and through the city. Most of them were on their way to vacation destinations in Florida. Aboard the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railway, which the editor said brought around 30 passengers per day through Brunswick, the Northerners peered out the windows with wonder at their new surroundings. This is a quote from the newspaper. The editor said, "When the train began to get into the city, and the new houses began to loom up on every hand, and the grand old oaks wet with dew to wave in the fresh morning air, a sudden change came over the party, and their delight knew no bounds. 'Oh, isn't that splendid?' said one. 'A perfect little paradise,' said another. Your editor could stand it no longer, so he said to the couple nearest him, 'Yes, friends, you have now reached the garden spot of earth, Brunswick, the city by the sea. Stop over with us, ladies and gentlemen, and spend a week at the Oglethorpe, and our word for it, you will go no nearer the land of flowers.' Then, the editor wrote, they all promised to stop on their way back." Our intrepid editor may have seemed an overzealous promoter to his fellow railroad passengers, even as they took in views like this one. But he and his beloved city certainly had much to be proud of. Notably, he was also promoting to these travelers a hotel that had opened just 4 days before the publication of this piece. The Oglethorpe was a point of pride for Brunswick, and it would appear in promotional pieces and guidebooks for decades to come. The Brunswick landmark was beloved from its opening day and even before. Although the hotel promised the city a new prosperity through tourism, its visitors on that opening day were scores of Brunswickians themselves. Over 500 proud citizens paraded through the halls of what the local newspaper made known was their hotel. "It is Brunswick's house," said a reporter. "Brunswick paid the first dollar for its erection, displaying her faith by her works, and now she has it, bought and paid for." As those hundreds of odd visitors explored the Oglethorpe Hotel's halls, on its opening night in January of 1888, their appreciation of the building may only have grown. They climbed red-carpeted stairways, they viewed their city through bead-curtained windows, and they examined the hotel's fine furnishings, which came from both as far afield as Belgium and Japan, and as nearby as interior supplier M. Rich and Brothers of Atlanta. What more can we say? Asked the Brunswick Advertiser Appeal. To adequately describe is impossible. Instead, the town of Brunswick proudly presented an illustration of the Oglethorpe and an invitation, as it said, to all Brunswick's friends, well-wishers, acquaintances, and enemies, as well as the world at large, to come and see the house that we have built, and the prettiest and most prosperous town that the sun ever shone upon, Brunswick, the city by the sea. Brunswick and St. Simons both seemed ready for a new birth as tourist destinations. Skipping forward, excuse me. Let me see if this will go back. There we go. The same year as the grand opening of the Oglethorpe Hotel also brought the opening of the Hotel St. Simons, which you can see here on the left. This hotel was overseen by the same owners as Brunswick's hotel. Located where Massengale Park is today, the Hotel St. Simons catered to summer vacationers, while the Oglethorpe mostly hoped to attract guests in the winter. The owners of both recognized these differing demands, and when one hotel closed for the season, they would just move furniture and staff from one hotel to the other. The Hotel St. Simons could accommodate about 300 guests at a time, both in this main building and in 20 cottages, which were scattered around the hotel. This original incarnation of the Hotel St. Simons in this picture would only last about 10 years. As writer Jingle Davis put it, the hotel was the only casualty of the Spanish-American War on St. Simons. The main structure burned to the ground during the short-lived war in 1898, although it wasn't directly due to the war, and the rebuilt version later also burned down itself. Despite its short tenure, the summer vacationers that the hotel drew to St. Simons only attracted more vacationers. In the area that's today Neptune Park, so right near us right now, close to the St. Simons Lighthouse and Pier, a group of small summer cottages, which you can see in this picture on the right, sprouted up. Since most of the cottages' owners were from Waycross, the enclave collectively named itself the Waycross Colony. It was a beloved vacation spot for this group of travelers for decades. As more tourists discovered the island, other hotels, including the Jekyll View and Bellevue, also sprang up in this southernmost section of the island. To reach the Oglethorpe Hotel, Hotel St. Simon's, or other venues on the island, though, travelers often had a hard road in front of them, or, in many cases, no road at all. When both hotels opened in 1888, the majority of passengers arrived here in the Golden Isles by rail or by boat. From the Oglethorpe Hotel's position on Newcastle Street, the hotel was a very short trip from several railroad depots and steamship wharfs that carried their customers to inland towns, to nearby islands, and to points beyond. But while the Oglethorpe Hotel was conveniently located by the rail yard and the steamships, travelers bound for the Hotel St. Simon's in its earliest years had to transfer off the train, take the steamship to the island, and then take a mule-drawn carriage. It was later a mule-drawn trolley on rails to their ultimate destination. Without a land access route from Brunswick to St. Simon's, visitors were left with options that required multiple transfers and often difficult travel. I also like to imagine taking a trip like this with one of those big trunks without wheels that people are always using around this time. Despite any of these inconveniences, though, the railroad lines and the steamer lines were both growing industries for Glynn County in the late 19th century, and each industry advertised both its freight and its passenger services. In the 1892 Brunswick City Directory, the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railroad and the Brunswick and Western Railroad both offered their services from the same ticket depot, which was described as on Bay Street at the foot of F Street. The proximity and the convenience of these services were selling points for clients of the Oglethorpe Hotel, but while the Oglethorpe and venues on St. Simon's may have offered pleasant and even luxurious accommodations, the trip to the city of Brunswick itself, and again to St. Simon's, undertaken by any traveler, was often not even particularly comfortable. In fact, that very same issue of the Brunswick Weekly Advertiser Appeal that published that article about tourists coming to Brunswick and the opening of the Oglethorpe Hotel also took plenty of space to lodge complaints about the local railroads on behalf of who they called the suffering traveling public. Here's that article. Travelers, again, on the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia Railway, as well as the Savannah, Florida, and Western Railway, both encountered problems at nearby Jessup, where many stopped to change trains and come into Brunswick. These changeovers often occurred at night, but neither railway seemed even particularly concerned with their customers' comfort. According to the newspaper, as both railways continued on from Jessup, they simply dumped passengers in the sand and left them to take the best care of themselves they can without even shelter, for neither road had even a waiting room at that point. For the amount of business done there and the amount of travel that stopped over every day and night of the year, the newspaper said, that place should have had a Grand Union passenger depot. And instead, it had some sand you could sit in by the side of the railway. For all their complaints, though, passengers may simply not have had much choice. Rail travel was time-consuming and could be really expensive, especially for passengers who wanted any measure of comfort. Wealthier passengers, like some clients of the Oglethorpe or the St. Simon's Hotel, traveled in private rail cars like the one seen here. These cars catered to the ultra-rich of the Gilded Age and included luxuries like private rooms and observation decks. Even this car, though, is seen in Everett, which was a stop outside of Brunswick. Here, its passengers might have transferred to a train that brought them just a little closer to downtown. Those passengers who couldn't afford their own private cars traveled in less comfortable conditions and often for periods that spanned multiple days. To travel by train from Brunswick to New York City took just under 40 hours in absolutely perfect conditions. Despite the patience required to undertake it, though, railroad travel was one of the more convenient methods of long-distance travel in turn-of-the-century America. By 1910, the railroads were powerful movers of both passengers and business interests. And along Brunswick's waterfront, railroad offices and depots shared space with steamship companies, which, like the railroads, advertised themselves as carriers of both passengers and freight. Yep, I'm skipping a slide again. Let's see if I can go back. Wow, skipping around on me. There we go. Okay, that was what I was aiming for, but I guess I had to bounce around on it a little bit. But again, here's a steamship schedule that was published in the newspaper. The Mallory and Savannah steamship lines sold tickets on the same street as the in-town railroad depots, from the wharf on Bay Street at the foot of Mansfield and Monk Streets in Brunswick. City directories from the 1890s showed that most of these steamers ran relatively local routes, at least within the first half of the decade. These local lines departed 2 or 3 times a week or even daily, and by the early 1900s, routes to St. Simons were run 3 times a day during the busiest parts of the year. Although by the turn of the century these freight steamships regularly left Brunswick's shores for European destinations, the local routes, like the ones to St. Simons, still dominated the waterways, and the ships that ran them enjoyed a degree of local celebrity. Let's see. I'm waiting a second to make sure there we go. Sometimes it sneaks up on me a little bit. But postcards depicted ships like the Adequan and the city of Brunswick that carried eager tourists back and forth from the city to the islands beyond. And if we can go back to that slide before for just a second, you can actually see that the St. Simons Transit Company was running the steamer Adequan that appears on this postcard. So you could get your ride over to St. Simons and then get a postcard of the ship that you had rode over on. Citizens of Brunswick took notice of all of this ship traffic in the Sound, as the Brunswick Advertiser Appeal noted in this piece, where they say, "The bay presented a lively scene this morning. The steamer City of Brunswick with her list of tourists for Fernandina, the Hesse with a good list of passengers and a heavy freight for Darien, the Egmont with her passenger list and freight for St. Simons were all steamed up and trying their wheels in the water like prancing ponies all ready to start on their journeys." As the city grew, this steamship business grew alongside it. By 1909, the city's own business, the Brunswick Steamship Company, was operating 4 newly constructed 3,000-ton steel steamships semi-weekly, connecting at Brunswick with 4 railroads that could bring passengers to Boston, Birmingham, Atlanta, Florida, and the Carolinas. Other lines dealt fully in shipping, and like FDM Strawn and Company's steamship line, they brought thousands of dollars in import and export business. For visitors to the city, though, the steamships were the only way to access the islands. In the days before the F.J. Torras Causeway, the ships that chugged solidly across the Sound every day provided a vital service to both residents and visitors alike, even if, as you can see on this postcard, it was just a 1-hour easy sail from Brunswick to St. Simons. Schedules for both rail and steam travel could be challenging to maneuver around, but even if a potential traveler wanted to operate on their own schedule, the nation's roads didn't always present themselves as a viable option. Even only 20 years before its construction, the idea of a causeway to St. Simons may have seemed counterintuitive to many Americans for several reasons. Besides the limited range of roads, especially in rural areas, by 1910, the condition of most of the nation's roads had become somewhat of a national joke. An often repeated story that was read into Congress's record in 1912 exaggerates these conditions, but shows how many Americans felt about the convenience of the road system or lack thereof. In this story, a pair of farmers meet on opposite sides of the really muddy road that separates their farms. They're talking to each other when one of these farmers notices a bowler hat laying in the middle of the road. And he thinks it's a nice hat, but he doesn't want to cross all this mud to get to it. So instead he gets out a fishing rod and casts it out and reels the hat in. But as he hooks the hat and reels it in, a man's head appears from the mud underneath the hat. And he expresses concern for this man and says, "Oh, you've got yourself in an awful fix." And the man beneath the hat says, "Well, I don't mind it so much, but it is very hard on the horse." So this postcard shows us a pretty idealized version of what some of the roads nearby might have looked like, but this picture from around the same time shows more what the reality of those roads might have been. As in the majority of the country, many roads around Brunswick and Glynn County could be unpaved, difficult to navigate, and turned into vast, impassable mud pits after a rainstorm. I wouldn't have wanted to be driving out there after the weather today. Like Americans as a whole, Brunswickians seem to be realizing the conditions of their roads and that those conditions could be improved starting around 1910. especially as automobiles made their way onto our transportation landscape. If the dismal state of America's roads was bad for the horse, they made for even rougher going for automobiles. Early adopters of this new technology who bravely set out on a rural drive were sometimes towed back to town by the very horse-drawn carts they hoped to outpace. One early periodical for automobile enthusiasts warned drivers that you never know what you can do or with a car till you try, and even then, you're often sorry you found out. A wide interest in automobiles and automobile routes certainly existed, but high hopes for car use were often cut off by impassable roads and lack of resources for drivers in between towns. In the last years of the 19th century, it was bicyclists and bicycle manufacturers that first began to seriously advance the cause of road modernization. The League of American Wheelmen, which was an organization from Newport, Rhode Island, wanted to increase protections for bicycles and support their widespread use. Through the publication of this pamphlet, which was called The Gospel of Good Roads, and an eventual periodical that was called Good Roads Magazine, these bicycle enthusiasts founded a movement that hoped to improve, evaluate, and build roads all across the country. When cars appeared in force on the national scene, motorists took up this Good Roads cause with vigor. The American Automobile Association was particularly active in this phase of the Good Roads movement, and its publications interested many of its members in the potential of cross-country road trips and in the eventual road accessibility of destinations like St. Simon's. In 1904, the American Automobile Association began hosting the Glidden Tours, which were named for an enthusiastic automobile promoter named Charles Glidden. These tours were low-speed races. Participants competed to reach checkpoints within a set amount of time, and they weren't necessarily trying to beat each other. They were just losing points if they were late to their destination. Signage was sparse and roads could be poor, so the race, like this one, was led by a Pathfinder car that showed racers the way to their destination. The tours followed different routes every year, and the 1911 tour led drivers from New York City all the way to Jacksonville. Although the route didn't pass through Brunswick somehow, the event still appeared in the Brunswick News and was noted for its length and for its difficulty. Days after the conclusion of the 1911 Glidden Tour, the news turned the town's passing interest in the race into an exciting new opportunity for our area. E.L. Ferguson, who was a representative of the Glidden Tour, was due to pass through town looking for a shorter route to New York and Jacksonville than the one that the racers had taken. They instead had gone closer to the middle of the state, bypassing Brunswick entirely. He also hoped to map out passable roads along the route and hold conferences on the Good Roads movement. The newspaper announced that Brunswick had a chance to get on a new highway, which Ferguson was planning to map out with this shorter route. By the end of the week, the newspaper was really excited to announce that Brunswick had made it onto the map of the auto highway between Jacksonville and New York. Furthermore, they said, representatives of the Glidden Tour proclaimed that the road from the Florida line into Brunswick was in excellent condition, which, given the muddiness of the roads back there, might have been a really exceptional thing for the roads around here. It seemed the beginning of a new era in which that excellent strip of road would attract promised hundreds of thousands of tourists bound for Florida each season. Brunswick, again, hoped that when they enjoy a few days of the delightful climate, said the newspaper, they will abandon their trip further south. Just a few years later, Glynn County had even more reason to hope for increased tourism. The Lincoln Highway, which was the United States' first transcontinental highway, was formally dedicated in 1913. It eventually ran, as you can see in this map, from New York to San Francisco. This project was the brainchild of a man named Carl G. Fisher, who was an automobile parts supplier from Indianapolis. The success of Fisher's east to west Lincoln Highway led him to the possibility of other transcontinental highway routes, and he put forward yet another idea, a north to south highway that would bring travelers from Chicago all the way to southern Florida. The idea for this road, which organizers named the Dixie Highway, and which would eventually look like this map, was presented at a December 1914 conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In its first months, this highway was proposed as a single route like the Lincoln Highway on the last slide. It would be a convenient yet scenic route that would bring a stream of tourists through the southern states. Within mere months after its announcement, this single route idea faced massive opposition from towns who had learned they would probably be bypassed by this new highway. This news sparked fierce competition among towns like Brunswick, who vied for a place on the Dixie Highway, and eventually, in Georgia, this competition became so fierce and sustained that organizers decided on an alternative solution. The Dixie Highway, said C.E. James, who was the president of the Highways Association, ought to be a system and not one route. As you can see from this later map of the Dixie Highway, that's exactly how it turned out. Representatives of our area desperately wanted to be part of, if not a landmark on, the eastern route of the Dixie Highway. On the right side of this map, the eastern route splits off around Knoxville, Tennessee, goes through western North Carolina and central South Carolina, and then follows the coast from Savannah all the way down to Miami. In March of 1916, Brunswick had the chance to prove itself to representatives of the highway, and the Brunswick News announced a complete program of activities since the Dixie Highway Commissioners would be passing through town. This program would include an arrival celebration, a dance, and a full banquet at the Oglethorpe Hotel that was set for 8 o'clock that evening. As the event grew closer, excitement only increased. Now, the newspaper said, school children with flowers were set to greet the commissioners upon their arrival in Brunswick. And then they urged every motorist in the city to bring their decorated car to welcome the group. And the 96 members of a special reception committee were listed in the newspaper. On the day of the event itself, a special notice on the top of the front page suggested in all caps that all of Brunswick should turn out today to meet the Dixie Highway Commissioners. A parade of cars would enter the city en route from Jacksonville at 5 o'clock, proceed down Norwich Street, and was planned to pass over the business streets before finally stopping at the Oglethorpe. The Dixie Highway Commissioners would surely have found this reception an interesting and compelling sight, too, if high winds had not significantly delayed their ferry trip across the Satilla River. At the time, the only way to bring your car across the river was to put it on a launch, which would just bring one car at a time slowly across the river. The newspaper announced that an effort would be launched in the near future to bridge the river and avoid situations like these, but it also chronicled the really hard-won accomplishment of safely bringing all the cars across with the help of multiple ferry boats. It took more than 4 hours for all of these cars to cross the river, but they finally did so with the help of a local sawmill owner whose name was J.O. Dial. When all the cars had crossed, everyone profusely thanked him and tried to pay him for his services, but he refused, saying all that the payment he wanted was the eastern route of the Dixie Highway. The distinguished visitors finally trickled into the city in a procession that lasted from 8:30 to midnight, so they missed that banquet at the Oglethorpe entirely. Even if that banquet, originally planned for 8 o'clock, may not have gone on as intended, the program set forward in advance shows just how eager Glynn County was for a spot on the Dixie Highway. The rest of this program included descriptions of the area's advantages, whether they were scenic, industrial, educational, or agricultural. It was set alongside photos of Brunswick, Jekyll, and St. Simon's Island. Even this dinner menu itself was sprinkled with these subtle hints that Brunswick was the perfect place for a section of the highway. I love the enthusiasm in this menu. I love that they printed it in red so that you absolutely could not miss it. Some of the selections from this say, one does not tour the swamps and deserts. One tours for comfort and pleasure. We have it. And then it continued with a list of nearby town names, and these names were described as names of historical significance connected by roads built by Oglethorpe, but today as modern as a 12-cylinder and traveled by thousands of automobiles and Fords, but we want more. The commissioners stayed through Wednesday and then continued north towards Savannah. If Brunswick had missed its chance for an impressive welcome to the commissioners, it was at least able to finish on a strong note. The group commented that the 12 miles of solid shell road between Brunswick and the ferry to Darien was the best they had experienced since leaving Macon, and the city received word that the Dixie Highway Commissioners had made it to Savannah in record time. Brunswick did end up with its own place on the eastern route of the Dixie Highway, which followed the coast from Savannah down into Jacksonville. Now, the only obstacle to the success of the Dixie Highway was the actual construction of the highway itself, which often proved a widespread challenge. The highway was built and improved where its route already existed by state and even more local governments. It led to vast differences in road quality, material, and speed of construction. When travelers passed from one state or even from one county to the next, they could encounter sudden and jarring changes in road construction. Flat, paved road in one county, and as they were called, unimproved dirt paths full of ruts in the next county. For their part, though, our local roads were usually praised for their quality in these days. The April 1915 issue of American Motorist magazine, which you can see a page from here, ran an entire feature titled On the Savannah-Jacksonville Route. These features were used to highlight stretches of road that were notable for their scenery, their historic value, or their quality, and the article's section about our area praised all three features. American Motorists described this area as a beautiful place and especially rich in legends of old colonial days. The fine shell roads within the city and also toward both Jacksonville and Savannah have been constantly improved until they're now in excellent condition for 15 miles toward Jacksonville and 10 miles toward Savannah. Also described were those local ferries over the St. Mary's and Satilla rivers, but the magazine took note of the improvement of the Altamaha River crossing. It was now instead run by a local trolley company that transferred cars over a bridge instead of having to load your car onto a ferry. Over a decade after Glynn County's eventful welcome party for the Dixie Highway Commissioners, the road's governing body, the Dixie Highway Association, officially disbanded. Instead, the U.S. numbered highway system was designated in 1926, and our path of the road that had been the Dixie Highway was instead renamed U.S. Route 17. The same was true across the country, where named roads were replaced by numbered routes agreed upon by the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. Despite the effort to coordinate and standardize route numbers across the country, these roads, like the named highways before them, were still maintained and updated by state and local governments. Certain sections of these numbered highways, like that Savannah-Jacksonville route that was mentioned in American Motorist, also gained their own regional and national reputations for road quality, attractions, natural beauty, or a combination of those factors. Highway 17, and especially the portion located in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, was often referred to as the Coastal or Ocean Highway. Although the roads were overseen by government entities, local commissions separated by state districts also promoted notable highways like the Ocean Highway. The Coastal Highway Commission helped to build and improve parts of Highway 17, partially under the leadership of a man named Alfred O. Townsend. Alfred O. Townsend is seen here on the left, or maybe I should say, he's the adult seen here on the left. He was born in McIntosh County, and he lived in Texas as a child, but by the time he was a teenager, his family had settled here in Glynn County, where they ran a cattle and a farming business. Townsend was involved in this business, but also became interested in local politics. He began his political career as a deputy clerk under H.F. Devinion, who you can see here on the right, in 1899. Townsend was later named Secretary of the County Commission, a position he would hold nearly without interruption until his death. Townsend also served on the Glynn County Planning Board and as a charter member of the Coastal Highway Commission, which he was the vice chairman of for many years. His work with the Coastal Highway Commission was so influential that after his death in 1939, the commission issued a resolution which stated in part that he gave unstintingly of his time and energy to the construction of the Coastal Highway, and this road will always remain as a monument to him and those who so faithfully worked with him in its initial construction. Long ago, he recognized that the prosperity of any community would depend largely upon the good roads which entered it, and he worked with energy and intelligence toward the construction of adequate highways in this part of the state. Alfred O. Townsend's dedication to good roads, their construction, and their importance to our community began even before his work on the Coastal Highway Commission. As the clerk of the St. Simon's Highway Commission, says the Brunswick News, Townsend labored in session and out for the success of the undertaking of the building of the causeway linking Brunswick and St. Simons. He was one of several Brunswick natives who were convinced of the ongoing importance of a Brunswick to St. Simons causeway and were determined to see this project through. Each one of them brought a unique set of experiences that ultimately combined to make our causeway a reality, and each of them benefited from the other's backgrounds. Reporter Clarence Levy of the Brunswick News once wrote that even Oglethorpe had dreamed of the causeway, and the desire went from generation to generation. Through the vista of the years, there was the hope that a smiling genie would build it, but then official Brunswick and Glynn County resolved to do for themselves what they had patiently waited for years and years for someone else to do. Oglethorpe's dream finally began to take shape in late 1922, when contracts began to be written for the causeway's construction. The dream approached, but it would take hundreds of workers and several of these important personalities to truly make it a reality. In 1923, when the idea for the causeway truly began to solidify, the mayor of Brunswick was a man named Malcolm Baker McKinnon. In a retrospective written in 1986, the Brunswick News wrote that McKinnon had actively urged the causeway across the marshes. Born in Brunswick on August 31, 1882, Malcolm McKinnon was the son of Daniel Baker McKinnon, who was engaged in the naval stores business, and Katie Powell McKinnon. Katie McKinnon's father was himself an early pioneer of railroad travel and construction in Georgia, and his grandson would follow in these footsteps. Malcolm McKinnon grew up in Brunswick and worked in the brokerage and oil businesses, while also finding time for civic connections and politics. By 1910, he was on the city council, and he would later serve as city commissioner and as mayor in a term that lasted from 1923 to 1924. Among other positions, he also served as a bridge commissioner on the St. Simons Highway Commission and on the executive committee of the same commission, as described in the program for the causeway's dedication in 1924. To engineer and build the causeway, Mayor McKinnon, along with Glynn County Chairman E.L. Stevens, approached Fernando J. Torras, who proposed a route that departed Brunswick near Gloucester Street and arrived on St. Simons near Gascoigne Bluff. According to Georgia's Coastal Illustrated, this proposed route made Torres's idea stand out, since the other surveys had shown a road at Cypress Mills, entering St. Simons at Frederica. Also, just a quick side note, one of my favorite things about this picture of F.J. Torras is that he's described as in his engineering attire. Torras may well have been used to standing out. Like McKinnon, he was born in Brunswick, but spent only 8 childhood years here before his father sent him to school in Spain. When he returned, he attended the Georgia Military Academy, and he later graduated from Georgia Tech. Even as a student, he seems to have distinguished himself. A profile of him states that years after his graduation from Georgia Tech, his family learned that his drawings had been framed and hung in the lobby of the engineering building. It was explained that none had done better. His credentials as an engineer and his fluency in 2 languages took him on famous jobs in exotic and out-of-the-way places. Shortly after his graduation from Georgia Tech, Torras was employed on one of these projects in out-of-the-way places. Over 6 years, from 1907 to 1913, he engineered and built the Madeira-Mamoré Railroad, a 226-mile rail line through the Brazilian jungle. It was a grueling project the Brunswick News described as a feat said to equal the building of the Panama and Suez Canals. With such a background, Torras was uniquely positioned to make the Brunswick to St. Simons Causeway a reality, even as authorities like the U.S. Corps of Engineers says that such a road was likely impossible to build. It would require multiple simultaneous efforts, including dredging material from the site of the proposed roadway, engineering and building drawbridges and trestles, and bringing in sand, gravel, and other materials to create a surface you could drive on. Undaunted, voters in Brunswick and Glynn County, about 1,600 of them, turned out to vote for a referendum to build the causeway. Out of 1,600 voters, there were fewer than 10 dissenting votes, and one of these fewer than 10 was a Mr. J.B. Wright, who owned 3 of the steamers that brought daily visitors from Brunswick to St. Simons. The overwhelming majority, though, jumped at the idea of a causeway. By January of 1923, F.J. Torras was the official engineer in charge of the project, and work had begun in earnest by April of the same year. Over the next year, the Brunswick News would provide regular updates about progress on the Causeway project. The newspaper's front pages provided an exciting month throughout May of 1923 for readers throughout Glynn County. Early in the month, the news announced that 2 tugs with pontoons were on their way to begin dredging work, and later on, it said that Superintendent Sackett of the Atlantic Gulf and Pacific Dredging Company had arrived with his big hydraulic dredge, which was apparently named Florida. The remainder of the month saw hundreds of workers sent to build the highway arrive in Brunswick. By mid-May, press and talk surrounding the causeway had built up much anticipation. In its May 16th issue, the Brunswick News published a proclamation by Mayor Malcolm McKinnon recognizing the importance of this, the day when work began on this monumental project. You can see this proclamation was on the front page. It's outlined in dots and stars over on the right side. In his proclamation, McKinnon said, "Whereas this great enterprise is of such vast importance mainly to the state, but particularly to the people of Brunswick and the county of Glynn, the event should be fittingly observed. Now, therefore, I, M.B. McKinnon, Mayor of the City of Brunswick, by virtue of the power vested in me, do hereby issue this, my proclamation, proclaiming a half-holiday on Wednesday, May 16, 1923, and do urgently call upon all our citizenry to abstain from their daily avocations at 12 o'clock noon on said day, to close their places of business, and unite in a general festival in honor of the occasion." The exercises, he said, were due to begin at the swimming pool on the boulevard at 2 o'clock p.m. on May 16th. The newspaper further explained that this kickoff would be celebrated with a barbecue at Lanier's Oak, speeches by locals like E.L. Stevens, who served as both chairman of the county commissioners and as bridge commissioner on the highway, and steamer excursions to the site of the planned highway so locals could inspect the beginnings of its construction. There would also, it said, be a formal ceremony which would include the digging of the first shovel of dirt by E.L. Stevens and by Miss Catherine McKinnon, daughter of Mayor Malcolm B. McKinnon. After this, work on the causeway continued nearly non-stop for more than a year. That first shovelful of dirt was followed by millions more. Newspapers described that to create the causeway, 986,000 cubic yards of solid material was moved from the nearby channels, making a beach-like roadway of beautiful white sand and shell. By January of 1924, the dredging work was finished, and the causeway's roadbed was spread with gravel, brought in by boats like the one seen here. 3 months later, in April, the causeway and bridges were judged complete, with the exception of one drawbridge. Like most road building projects of the day, the causeway's construction was financed locally by Glynn County and the City of Brunswick. Throughout the process, both local governing bodies and the general citizens of Glynn County remained highly involved. When just that one drawbridge was left to complete in April of 1924, many people from Brunswick drove across the nearly finished causeway just to turn around and drive back again. That was the entertainment value of the thing. 2 months later, in June, the final bridge was still not in a state to handle cars, but the Brunswick News reported that many hundred Brunswickians visited St. Simon's yesterday by the highway route. They parked their automobiles at the last bridge and walked over it to the island. From there, visitors at St. Simon's could rent cars to further explore, and many looked forward to the causeway's opening day for cars, which was promised later the same week. And as Sherry mentioned, the first day that cars were allowed to drive the full length of the causeway was June 26, 1924, 100 years ago today. It was even a Wednesday, which I think is really amazing. The day before the opening, the newspaper listed toll amounts for various types of vehicles on the road. The toll list included cars, freight trucks, buses, horses and riders, bicycles, and general foot traffic. To cross the causeway in a car, you would have to pay 25 cents, which is the equivalent of about $4.50 today. By the causeway's posted opening time of 1 o'clock, the Brunswick News reported, cars were parked along Glynn Avenue for a distance of half a mile. And when the hour finally arrived, there was a rush for the toll box, and in a few minutes, a veritable motorcade was stretched across the marshes. The mood was celebratory. Visitors were thrilled to finally explore St. Simons by automobile, and local news could not have been more complimentary of the causeway. The scope and everlasting stability of the immense roadway, wrote one reporter, makes one think it has been there forever. Still, the same sources promised, there was even more celebration to come. On July 11th, the Brunswick News reported there would be a formal opening of the causeway, marked by, as it said, a program the magnitude of which will surprise the people of the city and the visitors as well. When the day arrived, this program truly was spectacular. It began with a parade at 10 in the morning, led by floats and cars decorated by locals. These were followed by cars occupied by then-Governor Cliff Walker, members of the Georgia House and Senate, speakers for the remainder of the program, and other distinguished guests. And finally, these cars were followed by any other cars in the area that wished to join the parade. The route was published in this edition of the paper the day before the ceremony. That route was said it was down Newcastle to Mansfield, Mansfield to Union, on Union to Gloucester, and on out Gloucester to the Brunswick-St. Simons Highway and across the highway to the island. This issue also featured these photos of the Big Triumvirate, a group of local leaders, Malcolm McKinnon, E.L. Stevens, and F.J. Torras, that the news celebrated as responsible for the success of the new causeway. The parade began as promised, accompanied by 15 local beauties riding on the floats. One of these young women was named Mary Parker. She remembered later that her float broke down, and she was soon thrilled to find herself riding instead on the running board of the governor's car. This parade came to a halt only at the drawbridge crossing the Frederica River, where a formal christening ceremony would take place. A ribbon crossing the road was cut, and much as it had been at the digging of the first shovel of dirt for the causeway more than a year before, the honor of christening the Frederica River Bridge was given to Catherine McKinnon, the young daughter of Mayor Malcolm McKinnon. She's this little girl in the white dress at the front of the photo. An advertisement in the Brunswick News showed that owner of the steamers, Emmeline and Hesse, was still eager for business, and he promised that those aboard would be able to see the great parade and bridge opening by water. Once the crowds reached St. Simons at 11 o'clock, several speakers addressed the crowd, including John N. Holder, who was the chairman of the State Highway Commission, and Clark Howell, who was both the editor of the Atlanta Constitution and the Georgia director of the Dixie Highway. F.J. Torras, Malcolm McKinnon, and E.L. Stevens all briefly spoke, and they were followed by U.S. Senator Walter George and Georgia Governor Cliff Walker. While the attendees were invited to adjourn afterwards to a fish dinner, readers of the paper were also urged to bring a picnic dinner in case demand was just a little bit too high. Finally, at 3:30, the Brunswick Women's Club put on a historical pageant. It was split up into 9 episodes containing 22 different scenes, and it covered St. Simons and Brunswick history starting with Native Americans. From its earliest scenes, the pageant then progressed to vignettes of Spanish and English colonists, distinguished early visitors to St. Simons, like a naturalist named William Bartram, and scenes focused on writer Fanny Kemble and the Civil War. The scene in the photograph on this slide dramatized Oglethorpe's presentation of Georgia's charter to King George II. The pageant cast dozens of people from St. Simons and Brunswick, including African-American residents of St. Simons, and it drew to a close with a celebration of Sidney Lanier and his poem, The Marshes of Glynn. The entire ceremony, much like the causeway itself, was a great success. In a later estimate based on numbers of cars and local transit options, it was said that 8,600 people visited St. Simons on the day of the opening ceremony. This was an enormous influx for an island with a permanent population of only a few hundred. The toll money collected totaled $714.68, which the Brunswick News indicated was a higher amount, as they said, than any person connected with the project expected, and it is needless to state that all are delighted except the pessimists, and these are few in Brunswick right about now. Importantly for our area, though, the success of the causeway was not a short-lived phenomenon. Instead, over the next several decades, the Brunswick-St. Simons Highway firmly integrated itself into the culture of Glynn County, not only remaining useful on a daily basis, but also inspiring other ambitious projects and making a local name for its creators. Some of these creators continued to pursue road building projects. Chief among them was Malcolm McKinnon. After his term as mayor ended in 1924, he remained involved in local government, and at one point he sent this letter on the left to voters in Glynn County about an upcoming bond election. The $250,000 in bonds were meant to add new hard surfaces to roads on St. Simons, like the one on the right here. At the time, these roads were primarily surfaced with oyster shells. The letter also proposed another project, building a 2.3-mile road to connect the Frederica Bridge, or the last bridge on the causeway, to St. Simons with the pier. For $20,000 in bonds, the letter argued, drivers on the new road could save nearly 3 miles in driving distance. Roads on nearby Long Island, now called Sea Island, also underwent surfacing projects in the 1920s. Photographs on postcards like these in the Coastal Georgia Historical Society's collections always impress on me how hard and hot that work must have been, grading a new road on the island. Other projects on Sea Island weren't just spurred on by the construction of the causeway, they were planned by its chief engineer. As the island began to be promoted as a tourist destination all its own, the Sea Island Company hired F.J. Torras as planning engineer. He helped to plan the layout of the new developments on the island, paving the way for their success over the subsequent years and decades. The causeway's instrumentality to the Glynn County community was a constant, but new and unforeseen changes were also on the horizon for our area. Soon, Brunswick and St. Simons, like many communities, would be affected by the hardships of the Great Depression. In June of 1931, the city of Brunswick appointed a familiar face as city manager. Once again, who else but F.J. Torras? In a retrospective, Georgia's Coastal Illustrated would write that Torras helped to lead Brunswick through the remainder of the Depression and through World War II, when the city's population swelled to 60,000 as workers like the people in this photo flocked to the J.A. Jones shipyard. Through it all, he was there, guiding the city to a new phase of development after the Depression and the war. He wanted the town to be beautiful, a publication wrote, to attract tourists so much needed in the Depression years, and, yes, because he loved his hometown. After the end of World War II, many of those who had come to Brunswick as visiting workers like these wanted to return. Others from across the country who may have never visited before found themselves with more time, more money, and more accessibility, thanks to the causeway, to do so by car. Our area began promoting itself as a tourist destination once again, aided by easy access to St. Simons. Shortly after this new tourist boom began, in early December of 1952, Fernando J. Torras sadly died at home in Brunswick. Later that same month, the Brunswick Commission held a special meeting. At this meeting, a resolution was called to rename the Brunswick-St. Simons Causeway. I'm going too far again, aren't I? There we go. Hey, thank you. According to the Brunswick News, the renaming was a fitting tribute to a man who gave so much of himself to better the lives of those in his hometown as well as the world. And as this article in the Atlantic Journal notes, Torras's instrumentality to the causeway gave many people around the county and the state the same idea. Over the decades following the causeway's completion, the local area continued its stewardship of the road. In 1947, the causeway underwent an upgrading and repair project. Back in 1924, the entire Brunswick-St. Simons Highway had cost $412,000 to build. By 1947, just over 2 decades later, its upkeep was a $2.5 million undertaking. The contract for this work was awarded to the Tidewater Construction Company out of Norfolk, Virginia, which took a year to complete it, which was just about the same amount of time it had taken to build the causeway in the first place. By the 1960s, the causeway continued to create enormous demand for car travel to St. Simons. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, locals debated the benefits and drawbacks of plans for a second causeway, which were extensively studied throughout both decades. For a while, as Interstate 95's route through Georgia was being developed, plans for the road led it over the Sidney Lanier Bridge along the current path of US 17. If you look at the bottom of both of these pictures, Lanier Bridge is labeled just at the bottom, and the road would have continued following that route. This new route also included an additional causeway to St. Simon's. If you look in that picture on the right, there's that dotted line that cuts across the marsh. That's that second causeway. It would have entered the island just north of Fort Frederica. And this proposal was actually later expanded to include 2 new causeways to the island. They were called a middle and an upper route. In 1959, the state highway chairman, Roger Lawson, also clarified that the interstate would cut through the marshes and would go over the Torras Causeway on a bridge. Obviously enough to us today, those plans never quite materialized the way that they were planned. In January of 1977, the seemingly only edition of the Port City Post published a report titled "The Causeway Problem." The report measured the effectiveness of the causeway by gauging numbers of cars traveling across it each day, along with speed limits, maximum allowable vehicles, and peak travel times on the road. The second part of the report surveyed locals, asking this question: do you think we need a new causeway to St. Simon's or an alteration to the present causeway system? Responses varied. While some people talked about their commute to or from Brunswick each day, others felt a single causeway contributed to the established atmosphere of Glynn County. One respondent named William Horn said he wanted the causeway to stay the same. And I love this quote from him. He says, "If you put a bigger bridge in, it would become St. Simon's Peninsula." Another respondent named Ann Sorrow suggested adding lanes to the existing causeway. She told the paper, "People are going to live on the island anyway, as long as they keep selling land, so the highway may as well serve the people who are traveling it." Ann Sorrow may have had an eye for the future. The state of Georgia assumed ownership of the F.J. Torras Causeway in December 1981, and in October 1982, work began to add lanes to the causeway, making it a 4-lane road. This work on the causeway also added 2 high-level fixed-span bridges, which replaced the previous drawbridges that had allowed boats through the waterways around St. Simon's. By 1986, the new version of the causeway was ready. More than 60 years after its initial opening, another dedication ceremony was held for the road. The program for this ceremony, which you can see here, noted the construction of the bridges and the grading and paving of 3.295 miles of causeway, at a total cost of $22,897,186. Once again, state legislators and local officials gave remarks, including Joe Frank Harris, the then governor of Georgia. And just like the ceremony in 1924, this one featured a ribbon cutting and a causeway-spanning motorcade. Today, it's difficult to imagine a version of Glynn County where the F.J. Torras Causeway does not exist. So many people, myself included, use the causeway daily to get to work, to visit family or friends, to reach a favorite vacation spot, or just to go for a nice walk on the beach. As an initial and ongoing project, the causeway has had a deep economic impact, creating jobs, collecting tolls, and making many thousands of commutes possible daily. As a piece of our infrastructure, it has also had a deep social impact on our community, connecting 2 places that otherwise could feel isolated from one another. We've come a long way from the days of railroad to steamer to mule cart transfers to reach the Hotel St. Simon's. Instead, today, we live in a Glynn County where Brunswick and St. Simon's are neighbors with a path between our front doors. Less so neighbors than, I think, we are friends, here for a visit, but connected for a lifetime. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. I also want to introduce Darren Peach, who's the president of Torras Properties, who's going to talk a little bit more about the Causeway celebration, which is happening later in July.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, one more round of applause for Allison and the Historical Society. So this is actually the second time that we've had the pleasure of this presentation, and we did it at the college. I believe that our president of the college, who is also the college is a presenting sponsor for our celebration on the 13th of July, Johnny Evans is here. Thanks for being here, Johnny. Really appreciate it. We are absolutely... We're blessed to be in this community, and the support has been incredible for this event. I think that Allison, captured what happened 100 years ago and what the work of people before us meant to all of us, because all of us benefit from the amazing work that they did, the passion. It's hard to imagine with the tools and the resources that they had being able to design and build that causeway, but it just took so much effort from so many. So it's a special time for us. We have 3 presenting sponsors for the event, which is on the 13th of July, and those presenting sponsors are the College of Coastal Georgia, the Golden Isles Convention and Visitors Bureau, and of course our own Sea Island Company, who benefited greatly and probably wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for the causeway and then the work of F.J. Torras later to help build the original cloister and the roads that made up what was Long Island, now Sea Island, which Allison talked about. So we're very honored to have those presenting sponsors. We also have many over 50 other sponsors that are stepping up to help support this community event. Just a couple things that I want you all to know. First of all, this is meant to be truly a community event, not just about St. Simons and Sea Island, but about the whole county and the surrounding areas. So we will start a parade in the morning in Brunswick by the Brunswick Landing Marina. The parade will go down the road and weave to Newcastle, and then end at the old City Hall. So we start there. That's similar to the original parade route. We'll break away, and then there'll be a motorcade. We'll have many dignitaries, including the current governor of Georgia, who will be here for the motorcade, some antique vehicles. And then the actual event, the big event, will start around 11 o'clock at Gascoigne. And it'll be very similar to the original event. We'll have a fish fry, and then there'll also be a pageant. And we're going to take it from basically the era of the original causeway instead of going back in time. So each decade will be recognized, and there'll be performances. We'll have the Jekyll Island Big Band performing. We'll have all kinds of food and drink. We'll have many different activities, but the big thing is we just want the whole community to join us and really celebrate this special time. Let me just run through a couple of the key groups that have been involved. So, the hosts for the actual event are the City of Brunswick, Glenn County, the Golden Isles Development Authority, the Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Brunswick Chamber of Commerce, the Downtown Development Authority. Our official partners, which of course includes the Coastal Georgia Historical Society, and they've brought a complete, high quality flavor to this whole event. So we're so honored that you've been, Sherry Jones, Mimi, of course, Allison, have been working with us closely to make sure that we are accurate with our history, that we're getting the best content for everything that will be presented during the event. And then I do want to mention that we have the Soglo Gallery, Linda Gallagher, who's the pageant chairperson. We have Keep Golden Isles Beautiful. Many of you saw that we started with kicked everything off with the cleaning of the causeway a few weeks ago. And any proceeds that we raise above the cost of the event will go to Keep Golden Isles Beautiful to help keep the causeway beautiful going forward. So we hope that by buying the tickets and participating, you'll help us support the beautification of the causeway. We have the St. Simons Land Trust. We have the Casina Garden Club. We have the culinary department of the College of Coastal Georgia, which will also be involved in serving the food and the fish, along with the other food. And then I also want to mention that basically our county government and the City of Brunswick government has been hugely supportive of making sure that we have everything in place so that this event is great. So with that, you can go to the website causewaycelebration.com. It'll give you all the details on the event, and you can buy your tickets. And if you have any questions, I know Allison or Sherry will help direct you to us so that we can help. And we hope that all of you will be there on the 13th, because this will be the event of your lifetime, we promise. Because I don't know about you, but I will not be here 100 years from now, at least in this form. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Allison Historical Society, for such an amazing event. And if you want to come again, we have another event on the 10th of July, just before the celebration. So anyone that wants to be here, we'd love to have you. And if you know of someone that doesn't know about it, please share the word so that we can share this with others. Thank you all.